Resourceful Designer, Episode 3, Dealing with Photographers.
Welcome to the Resourceful Designer Podcast, offering solutions to streamline your graphic and web design business so you can get back to designing. And now, your host. He remembers when cut and paste required an X-Acto blade and a waxer, Mark DeCote.
Welcome. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Resourceful Designer as we explore ways to better run and manage our design business. Now, I'm very happy to be bringing my very first guest interview for the podcast. And today, joining me from Calgary, Alberta, right here in Canada, is award-winning photographer Brett Gilmour. Now, Brett specializes in location photography, architecture, people, places, you name it. His images have been featured in advertising campaigns and magazines around the world, and he's been honored with 3 Gold Nugget Awards for architectural photography, the highest honor in North America. His clients include General Electric, Shell, Estee Lauder, Chevron, and that's just to name a few of them. Now, before we get to the interview, I have a little confession to make. I actually conducted this interview over a year ago. You see, my original intention was to launch Resourceful Designer on October 1st, 2014. But for reasons I won't get into now, I ended up putting that off, and with the intention of waiting a couple of months, and a couple of months turned into more and more and more, until finally a year's gone by, and I'm only now launching the podcast. Now, when I finally decided to just get down with it, my original intention was to just switch my date and launch on October 1st, 2015. But then I remembered that one day prior, September 30th, today is International Podcast Day. And I thought, what a great way to celebrate International Podcast Day than to launch my podcast on that day. And that way I'll always remember what day I launched Resourceful Designer. So that's what I'm doing. Now, Brett and I had a great conversation, as you'll hear. And even though it's a year old, the information is just as pertinent today as it was then. Now, one last thing before I play the interview is I put together a little cheat sheet of some of the things that Brett's going to talk about. So if you ever have to hire or deal with photographers, you might find my cheat sheet with various questions to ask, something to keep on hand. And you can get that free by going to resourcefuldesigner.com/photographer cheat sheet. So without further ado, here's the interview. Welcome, Brett, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks. My pleasure to be here.
Now, Brett, before we get into the meat of this interview and why I invited you on the show, tell us a bit about what got you into photography in the first place.
Started a long time ago when I was a kid. We, as a family, traveled a lot. And when you travel, there's a camera around. And somehow I ended up being the person with the camera. And I think that sparked the passion. And then I just pursued that through high school and was fortunate to have a great high school art teacher who taught us photography. And from there, I went on to university where I studied a bit of fine art. Then I always tried to get into the industry, but found myself as a ski bum and just kept working at it on the side and eventually made the shift into full-time photography back in 1998.
98. So you've been doing this for a little while now.
It's been a while now, yeah.
And as I mentioned in my introduction, you specialize in location photography, architecture, and people and places. Has it always been such?
Not really. I initially lived in the mountains. And like I said, I was a ski bum and worked at ski resorts, lived in mountain towns. And so the photography I was doing was more about skiing, ice climbing, rock climbing, that kind of stuff, adventure sports. Eventually, I met a woman and moved to Calgary. And once I got to the big city, I was just too far from the mountains to really pursue that as a career anymore. And so I shifted over to the commercial photography.
And that's been working out obviously well for you?
Yeah, it's been a great shift.
Yeah. Now, the reason I got you on the show here is because my listeners are mostly web and graphic designers. And I wanted to talk to a photographer about the communication between the two, or sometimes lack of communication between the two. Whenever either a designer or an agency or a studio hires a photographer for a job, and just that whole process, and if there's any way to streamline it from a photographer's point of view, if there's anything that you would want from a designer or anything that a designer should do differently for hiring a photographer. Now, I'm just going to give you a little story here. A year or two after I first started on my own and I started my design studio, I was hired by one of the big Canadian universities to do a project they had just renovated their entire engineering department. And they hired me to do the marketing pieces for their engineering department to give to potential students that were looking at engineering. Now, they didn't have in their budget for me to fly down to do a site view of their new area. So what I did is I needed photos. So I looked online. I found a photographer that did similar to what you do, location type photography. And I talked to him, and after a while I decided to hire him, and he would be my eyes on location. And I kind of told him what I wanted as far as the photography goes, because I'd already discussed all this with the university on what the whole layout and everything would be. And he did an okay job of kind of capturing what I wanted, but I wasn't 100% happy. And I don't know where the communication went wrong with that. Like, he gave me the photos of the people, the faculty, the staff, and that, but there was just, I don't know, there was something missing, and it's not the vision I had. And as I said, I don't know if it was him misinterpreting what I was saying or if I wasn't communicating something right. So that's kind of what got me this idea of let's interview a photographer for this episode of the podcast.
It's a great idea, and I'm glad you're tackling the subject. I think that the arts are really, really subjective. And if we put 10 people in a room and ask them all to draw the same scene, you're going to get 10 different drawings.
For sure.
And so that's where the breakdown starts, is because it is so subjective. So what I find has been really helpful for me over the years is lots of communication over the phone. Verbal is good, but then I find what's better is a storyboard. So especially if I'm working remotely with a client, which I do a lot, I find I always ask them to send me sample photos or a storyboard or layouts of what they want. And that gives me a really good idea of what they want. Because if they explain it to me, it's just so open to interpretation, I can go wrong, or I might not get it quite right. But if they send me photos or drawings, then I have something that's quite tangible that I can go after, and I can try and create photos that look like that. And over the years, it's gotten easier and easier through digital technology. And what I do now often is I'll get to site, and if my art director or the creative director or whoever the client is isn't there with me, I'll walk through with a cell phone and just snap shots, send them back to them directly, get on the phone, and then say, does this angle look right to you? Am I capturing in this scene what you want to see? And I can get a very quick yes or no. And then from there, I can set up my lights, set up the camera, and start to shoot. And even in the middle of the shoot, we can then take some captures, create JPEGs, email those to the client. Even when there's no Wi-Fi now, I can just make my phone a hotspot, send a JPEG off to the client, and get an approval right in the middle of the process. So it's definitely gotten a lot easier to stay on track and create the vision that the client wants.
Yeah, technology's really come a long way. If you even go back about 5 years ago, none of this would have been, well, some of, but not all of this would have been possible.
Absolutely.
When you're talking about sample stuff, it would be something as simple as finding a stock photo from one of the stock websites and saying, I want something similar to this, or is that the sort of thing? Yeah.
Yeah. I'll just say, go on Google, use the image search on Google. You just type in what it is you want to look for or what you want to see, make the search image specific, and then create a little gallery and send those to me in an email. And that's a great place to jump off and get started. And on a bigger project or a bigger budget project, you might spend a little more time on that on the front end and refine that vision and go back and forth on the phone a little more to make sure we're really going out to create the vision the client wants to see.
Okay. Now let's back this up a little bit. Say I'm a designer and I want to hire somebody somewhere where I can't be. I'm looking for a photographer. What sort of things, like if I don't know, like say I'm looking in Calgary where you are, my first thought would be I'd just go online and Google photographers in Calgary. What sort of things should I be looking for? What sort of questions should a designer be asking the photographer? Because looking at the portfolios of the photographer, there's a lot of nice photos, but it might not be the right match. So what sort of questions should we be asking a photographer before hiring them?
I think that a good place to start is ask them who they've worked for, who they currently work for. So you get a sense of what kind of clients are hiring them. Mm-hmm. Ask them how long they've been working for. Ask them what kind of equipment they're working with. And it's really not about the equipment so much, but do they have studio strobe lights? Or do they just use speed lights that connect to the top of the camera? Right there's a big differentiator. Mm-hmm. What kind of modifiers do they use with their lights? Have they worked with ad agencies? Have they worked with art directors, creative directors? These are the kinds of probative questions that will tell you the level of client somebody has worked with in the past.
Yeah.
And then I would also ask to see not just their personal portfolio, but have them send you to websites where their work is featured. And that way you can see what it looks like on the client side.
Yeah. Because a lot of times looking at the photographer's portfolio, They could have a beautiful website with beautiful photos, but a lot of time that's just because they happen to have a good web designer working for them that can make them look really good.
That's really true. And then there's also, I don't think it applies to everybody, but in Calgary and with my clients, I have a lot of clients who actually have a clause that prohibits me from displaying any of the work I shoot. And it's because there's a lot of proprietary technology created in Calgary. And so company XYZ doesn't want company ABC to see what I photographed.
Mm-hmm.
But what's funny about that is then eventually they'll release that on their website. So I can eventually send clients to that website and you can see the work over there. So a lot of the stuff I shoot, I actually can't even put in my portfolio.
No, but it's out there for people to see.
Eventually it is, yeah.
Yeah. So that's good. So that's a good way to start. So, okay. So then what would be the next step? Once we decide, okay, Brett, I would like to hire you as a photographer. What would be the next step that you would expect from the designer?
That's where we'd start the conversation about what the images are going to look like. But if we just back it up a little bit to the hiring process, I would say another thing to do is don't get just one estimate. Ask 3 or 4 photographers for an estimate. And if it's a small project like just headshots, the approach to it doesn't matter as much, although I would still try and quantify that. But if it's a bigger project like an architectural photo shoot or corporate portrait of some big time executive, where their time is really crucial and you're only going to get 5 minutes, you need to know that the photographer can get that portrait in 5 minutes. And so that's where, if you ask just for a number in the estimate, you can't tell a lot about how the photographer operates. So I would ask the photographer for their approach. How are they going to handle the client? How are they going to set up? How much time do they need to set up? What equipment are they going to bring to the photo shoot? Are they going to have a photo assistant with them? How are they going to handle an equipment failure? Do they have backup equipment? All these questions will start to tell you if someone is really qualified for the job you're asking them to do. And a good example of that is if you're photographing someone like the CEO of Shell Canada, you're going to be lucky if you get 5 minutes of that person's time. And I photographed him and we got 3 shots. And at the end of 3 shots, he said, that's enough. And he walked off the set and left the room. And that was it. If we didn't have it in 3 shots, we were hosed. We had been promised 5 minutes and he was there for less than 2 minutes for sure.
Wow.
So you got to be ready.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Good stuff to know. So now that you've hired a photographer, now that I've hired a photographer, say, and we start talking about the project, say it's an architectural project, what sort of things, especially if I'm not on location, I've been hired by a company and say, okay, there's a building in Calgary that needs to be photographed. What do I expect the photographer? Like, as you said, you might walk around with your cell phone and take some pictures and all that for me to see the building. Because maybe the company showed me some quick snapshots, unprofessional, like just that they took themselves. So how much of the vision I'm showing or I'm thinking of, do I try to get the photographer to do, or do I have to rely mostly on the photographer to tell me that what I'm thinking is possible, not possible?
Yeah, that's where I think that having good telephone conversations, especially when you're working remotely, email is good to a point, but it's kind of cumbersome. Mm-hmm. So just jumping on the phone, talking back and forth, you do that ahead of time. I use checklists. I love checklists. So for different types of photo shoots, I have different checklists. I have one for car photo shoots. I have one for architectural interiors, one for exteriors. I don't really have one for portraits. I kind of have that one in my head, I guess. And the checklist is not just for me. I have one for me, but I also have one for the client, which I would share with the graphic designer or whoever hired me. And especially with architecture, there's so many little details that I think should get taken care of. On a really good shoot, they should always be taken care of. And it's things like, are we going to have a street sweeper come by and clean the streets so we don't have debris on the street? Are we going to have a water truck come by and hose down the streets and sidewalks so they have a nice shine to them because it looks better in the photo? Are we going to have landscapers come by a week ahead of time and do all the landscaping, get everything looking good, take the weeds out? Are we going to have the maintenance guys come by a week ahead and not change all the light bulbs, but look for any burnt out light bulbs, make sure they're all lit? And it's those little details that really make a great photo. Are we going to have window washers come and clean the windows of the building? And those are things that most people don't think of, and they take time to get done. They take a bit of money to get done. And so as much as everyone seems to hate the conversation, I always ask what the budget is to get the shot. And it's because, if it's a small budget, we skip all those things and we just get the photo. But if the budget is there or the importance on the photo is there, and I do have clients that will bring in the water truck, we bring in the sweepers, We bring in the landscapers, and all of those little details get taken care of. And so we create a schedule with milestones for each of those events to happen. Other things we have to work with are the security team, because we may need to get into the building. Often we're shooting at dawn or at dusk. And so most of the workers that work in the building are gone. So to get in and out, you need to have the security team, and they need to be aware that we're coming. They need to be able to get us into the building. But you also need a maintenance person on site, because we'll want to have all the lights in the building turned on. And let's say it's a hotel or an office building. It can take an hour to turn all the lights on. So, all these little details you have to plan ahead for. Get in there, turn the lights on at maybe 3 p.m, but make sure they stay on. Often there's a computer that controls it. And so you get them all on, you get everything looking great. And just before you're ready to shoot, the computer turns all the lights off. And so you have to have that guy, whoever's in charge of that system, ready to turn them back on.
So when you're talking about stuff like this, like having a maintenance guy on hand, a security guy on hand, having window watchers and all that, is that all worked into the photographer's budget? Is that the agency that's taking care of that stuff? Or is that the potential company that you're actually shooting? Are they responsible for that sort of stuff?
Well, that's all decided ahead of time during the conversations back and forth. And that's why I use a checklist, because there's just so many little details. And so we say, okay, if we have the budget for the street cleaner, who's going to make that call? Who's going to book them? Who's going to pay for them? A lot of my clients, if it's bigger commercial architecture, I'm usually hired by the architect or the builder or one of the trades. So they'll know, or they will own a street sweeper. So they'll send their own machine out or one of their contractors out. But if it's a hotel, that's not the case. So now we have to go find a third party and bring it in. And so all those little details, you just have to go through and check it off. And usually I put that responsibility on the client to make sure all that stuff is ready and in place.
Okay. And in some cases, that client is the studio, or are you talking, when you say client, are you talking about whoever the building is that is the client of the design studio?
I'd say whoever calls to hire me.
Okay.
So if I get called by an ad agency, we'll talk about it, and then we'll make an agreement. And if it's an agency, usually what they'll do is they'll say, okay, well, my client, the hotel, I will make sure they have all those things in place.
Okay. That's good. Okay. So when it comes down to doing a photo shoot, you talked about scheduling with, like, say, a CEO of a company or something like that, so that you're working around his schedule when he's available and stuff like that. But when it's, say you're doing architectural photography, say you've got a deadline. What happens if, like, say, the weather is not playing into your deadline or something like that, which I'm sure is a very realistic situation, and the agency or whoever tells you, we need a photo by such and such a day? Like, what happens in cases like that?
There's weather is, with exteriors especially, it controls the day. So when we're going through the back and forth ahead of time in the pre-production, we always have a conversation about the weather. If we have a little extra time, we'll schedule weather delay days, but those, you have to pay me for those days, because I can't work for anyone else. I have to show up, be there, be ready. And if the weather doesn't cooperate, we just wait, and eventually we'll call it and go home. But if the budget is there, we always like to schedule in those days. And it's really, if the timeline is more important, then we just have to go ahead and shoot. And you just have to do your best and work with the weather. And bad weather can be good. I've had clients tell me, no matter what, don't shoot if it's raining. Don't shoot if it's cloudy. Don't shoot if it's overcast. We want to have those beautiful blue sky shots. But I'll show up, and you just never know, especially sunrise. You show up and it's pitch black, and then the sun starts coming up, and you really don't know. Is it going to be sunny? Is it going to be cloudy? You really have no idea, especially in a town like Calgary, where it's a big city, covers a big geographic area. There's so many little pockets where the weather is different. And with the mountains, the weather changes every 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of days where I wake up and it's 3 or 4 in the morning. By 4 a.m., I'm on site ready to shoot. By 5, the sun is coming up, and it comes up and it's totally overcast. So there's times I just go home, but there's other times where I'll just sit there and wait it out and shoot and submit those shots to the client who just said, no matter what, no overcast shots. But maybe it rained a little bit, and now the pavement's all wet. And so the lights are glaring off the pavement, and you've got all these beautiful colors reflecting in the pavement, and the asphalt looks nice and black instead of dull gray. And all the vegetation has a nice glow to it. The greens really come out, and they say, wow, that's a fantastic shot. And we'll just go with it. Mm-hmm. So sometimes you kind of have to just go your own way and follow your gut and make the shot. And if the timeline is really the important thing, because there's an annual report that has to get done, you just have to shoot. And worst case scenario, you'll strip out the gray sky and put in a blue sky, and then adjust the lighting on the buildings to add more contrast to try and make it look like it was a sunny day.
Yeah. The joys of Photoshop.
Yeah.
So now, in your experience dealing with agencies and designers, what are the things that designers say miss the boat most on, like forget to ask or just don't think of when it comes to hiring a photographer or having a photographer fulfill their end of the deal?
I think there's probably a lot of things. I think that there's more missed than there is taken care of. And I think it's probably because at the end of the day, a lot of designers don't work with photographers regularly.
Mm-hmm.
And so because of that, we just don't have the experience of working together. We don't have that workflow figured out, just not a normal everyday part of the workflow. And it's everything from not providing layouts to not providing really clear art direction. I don't want to get into the technical side too much, but if you get into that, what file type do you need me to deliver? How big does it have to be? You know, are you going to run it in billboard, on the side of a bus, in a magazine, or just on web? I always work to providing the images to the biggest possible size.
Yeah.
Because it's easier to dumb them down. You can't really make them better.
Yeah.
Or bigger.
Because they might want the photo for a website, but then 6 months down the road, they might say, oh, that photo would look great on a billboard. And you're shot if you shot it for a website.
Yeah, exactly. So I always try and shoot for the biggest, and then you have that in the archive.
Mm-hmm.
But those are a lot of the little details that should get taken care of on every shoot, but that often get missed.
Okay. Now, whenever you have, like, say, an art director on site with you, what are the difficulties with working with somebody on site that's directing you who is not necessarily a photographer? You're the photographer. You know your art. What sort of miscommunications and stuff occur in those situations?
I would say the biggest problem is that, and I hate to say it, but most of the shoots I've done, and this is over since 1998, we're talking 14 or 15 years, when an art director or a creative director comes to the site, most of the time, especially the last 5 or 10 years, they play games on their telephone and they don't pay any attention whatsoever to the photo shoot. And so they have this amazing opportunity where they can give creative input right in the middle of the shoot as it's happening and help direct the flow of it. And they end up just doing email or talking on the phone or playing video games. So that's probably the biggest missed opportunity. And really, to me, it's the biggest difficulty. And when it works for me, when it's fantastic, is I love when they get in there and they say, you know what, let's move that piece of furniture a little bit over here. Or if we're doing a portrait, let's take that painting down. And, I saw a better painting in the hallway, and they run and they grab the painting in the hallway and they put it up behind the CEO, and we'll move the desk a little bit over here. And they get right in hands on and they give that art direction. Then I can focus on more of the technical aspects and the lighting and the composition. And we end up creating, the two of us together will create a better project.
Yeah. Now, being a designer, I know, like, taking that same situation, I actually don't like having somebody sitting over my shoulder. I prefer be alone and do this here. And I know most designers are like that. They don't like having their client or that looking over their shoulder as they're doing their website or doing whatever design for print or designing a logo or whatever. So on site, I don't know if the designers have that mentality that you're the photographer, you're this professional in this situation. I don't want to interfere with you the way I don't like my clients interfering with me. So I don't know if that's the mentality they have going in, and that's why they're not really talking to you. But you're saying you would actually prefer if they help you out and that way they get the stuff that they actually want.
Absolutely. Yeah. I did a photo shoot over the weekend when we had an art director, a creative director at the shoot. And it was fantastic because, I was creating my composition and setting up my lighting. And there's a lot of technical aspects I have to work on live. And so if someone else is noticing that there's a smudge, it was a product shot. And so if someone else can look at it and say, you know what, if we just change that background a little bit or put the highlight instead of at a 45-degree angle, at a 65-degree angle coming down, I think it'll look better. It'll have this, it'll just read better in the magazine or whatever. And they know what the end use is. I don't always know what that end use is going to be. Mm-hmm. I'm just sort of hired to shoot a product shot without knowing if it's where it's going to end up. And so they can be thinking about that and how it's going to look best in that final use.
Okay.
Yeah, I really like that back and forth.
Okay. So in a situation like that, how would you deal with an art director on site who does interact with you, but instructs you to do something that you think just doesn't work, or you think it actually makes the shot you're taking worse or such? You say you don't always know the end use, but you're the expert in the photography and in capturing that single image. What happens when somebody tells you that I want to do this and you really don't think it'll work?
Sometimes you just have to go through with it and follow through. And sometimes you follow through and you find out, you know what, they were right. and you end up with a really good image. And other times your instinct maybe was right and you follow through and you create the shot. And the beauty is today we can look at it live on the monitor on the computer and you can see right away. You can both come over, have a look and show them that shot. If it's not too far off of what I want to create, I can then create my version of the shot, or, if we have the time, and we can look at both side by side. And that happens fairly often where somebody gives you an idea. That's especially true when it's a marketing director or an investor relations person who's often my client. So they don't have the arts background. They have more of a finance background or a business management background.
Okay.
And they have a great idea, what they think is a great idea, and they pitch it. And right away you think, oh, I don't know if that's going to work. But you just got to go through and do it. And they're the client. They're paying for the bill. Everyone's there on their dime. And I think you have to just go through and do it. And if it works, it works. And if it doesn't, you have to be able to pull something out of your pocket and still create an image that works. You still want to deliver a great image for them.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of it comes back to what you said way at the beginning there of the putting 10 kids in there and they all come up with a different drawing. Like your idea and their idea might be totally opposite, but in the long run, both ideas probably work.
Well, they might, and sometimes they don't. But it's if they're paying the bill, client's always right. And then maybe you can just say, well, how we got that done. Why don't we try this? It's nice to be able to introduce something you think might be better. And hopefully they go for it, and hopefully you have time to do that.
Yeah, and I know from the design point of view, we have the same situation where the client will ask for something, and we don't know darn well it doesn't work, but you just have to do it. And sometimes they love it, and you don't know why, but they go with it. And sometimes you could convince them to change and do it in your vision and such. But I guess it's all the creative niche that we all live in. It's just one of the burdens we have to bear.
Make the logo bigger.
Exactly. So when it comes to the other stuff involved, like if you're going on site to shoot something and there's going to be people involved, should the designer worry about release forms and all that? Or is that something we should just automatically think you're going to take care of all release forms if there's people on site?
That's a great question. I would say there is nothing you should take for granted. Anything that you think of, we should have a conversation about it and decide ahead of time who's going to take care of it. And that includes model releases. Unless I forget, I always bring an extra pad of model releases. I have my own, and I just carry it in a file folder that goes in my camera bag. And I generally use my model release. The language in it is designed to protect me. If I rely on a client to bring the model release, and sometimes they insist, the language in theirs will be written to protect them. And usually there's nothing in there to protect me at all.
Okay.
And it's just too big a risk. I don't want to be left hanging in the wind. If someone's, for whatever reason, if down the road someone decides to have a lawsuit, maybe they were an employee and you photographed an employee, then they split and they leave that company on bad terms and they want to get back at the company, they could decide they want to just sue and say they don't have a model release or whatever, or that their likeness was used in a way they don't agree with. Well, if the model release covers the company but not me, they could still sue me. And in those cases, I'll try and have the company's model release get done. And then I'll bring out mine and have them sign mine as well.
So in the situation, what you recommend then is that everybody sign two, one for the photographer and one for the agency? Or when we sign does it cover everybody?
Yeah, mine covers, it's designed primarily to cover me, but it does cover everybody.
Okay.
And I make them fill in, I fill it in with them. And it says what the shoot is for, who the client is, what the subject is, where the location was. It's quite specific.
Okay.
But anything like that, I think it's you just have to have a conversation ahead of time and who's you're going to use and who's going to bring it to the set and make sure it gets done.
Okay. Now, once the shoot is all done and you've packed up all your gear, what should again, I guess this all comes down to the conversation that was had up front, but what should the designer or the agency expect from the photographer? Again,
that all happens in a conversation up front. And it's based mostly on deadlines and how tight those deadlines are. I always tell people up front that I like to have about 5 days to be able to go through the images, 5 business days to go through the images, put them up into, I create an online gallery that's password protected. And then you can download the images from there. Those will be proofs and they're going to be watermarked with the word proof on them. Let's say we're doing a product shot of a bottle of ketchup. So during the course of that photo shoot, we might try a bunch of different things, ketchup on a yellow background, ketchup on a white background, ketchup with French fries in front of it, a bunch of different things. So I'll put all those different versions of the shot up. And that way the client the art director, the creative director, the graphic designer, everybody has a chance to look at it, and then they can make their selections. And ultimately, I guess the client has the final selection, but somebody will give me that final selection. And they send me the email with, we want this one, and this one. And then we say, okay, give us another 5 business days. And we will then process those, turn those raw files into what we call a master file. And then we will deliver the master files via another gallery.
Okay.
And I use 2 separate galleries so that the files don't get mixed up.
Okay. So when you say you take the raw file and you process it, give me an idea of what that means, that you're turning a raw file into a master file.
Sure. We shoot in the raw format, and most cameras can do that. Most professional all professional cameras shoot raw. And it's a file format that unless you have special software, you can't even open those files. So then once we get those files, we'll go through, just like in the old days, digital cameras all end up putting little dust spots on the photos. So we'll go through each photo with a zoomed in as, at 100% or 200%. We'll remove all those little black dust spots. Then any imperfections we'll remove. The camera is designed to give you what's called a flat file. So the color is very flat. There's not a lot of contrast. We'll go in and we'll put in what we think is the appropriate amount of contrast. And that depends on the scene, and it depends on what the final image should look like. Mm-hmm. But we'll play with the contrast, the saturation, the color balance. Sometimes, for example, the shot we did on the weekend, we had to shoot someone's legs, and then we had to shoot a bottle of Tabasco, and then we had to shoot socks flying through the air. And we had to take those 4 different shots and combine them together into one photo. So essentially a photo illustration. Mm-hmm. So all those different parts were selected, cut out of the background, put onto a new illustrated background, and blended together to look like one photo.
Okay. And that was something that you would do on your end? It
is, yeah. We did all that.
Okay. Now, is that just because the talking up front, that it was decided that you would do that thing? Because from my point of view, I'm thinking that would be something that the designer would be doing, taking those images and putting all that together.
Yeah, in my experience, that's usually what the photographer does. And so photo illustration is generally done by a photographer or there's actually people who are full-time photo illustrators who also will do that part of it. So they'll work strictly with the photo files. But then things like adding the company logo or the font or the copy, that's where it would get handed off to the designer.
Okay.
In my experience. It can be handled either way, but in my experience, we like to put the parts together. And what I find is we're better at putting those parts together and making them look like they all were shot in one frame. But then things like adding copy or choosing copy or placing copy, I'm not good at that.
Okay. So I have one more thing I wanted to talk here is contracts. Whenever a designer or an agency is hiring a photographer. Now, an agency, we always like to get our clients to sign contracts and all that. Who normally, is the photographer giving the agency a contract to sign, or is the agency giving the photographer a contract to sign, or where does that work? Do both sides have their own contracts that they want signed? What's the norm?
The short answer is yes. Yes to all of those. Generally, I have my own contract. And I always try and use my contract. Again, a lot of it comes down to covering your ass and protecting yourself. So my contract is written to protect me, but it's also written to protect my client. And the stuff that's addressed in my contract, such as rights management, what the rights are that I'm granting to the client. Because even if I'm hired by a client to make a photo, I still have the copyright. And so in my contract, there's a little bit in there about how they can use the photo, where they can use the photo, how long they can use the photo for, what happens if they want to use it longer or in, a wider distribution. It also protects them though from who I can resell that photo to. A big piece of how photographers make their money is by reselling work they've created. Mm-hmm. And so it talks about, can they do that, or who can they resell it to, or for how long can they resell it, what region they can resell it to, what industry we can resell it to. Often clients bring their contract to the table. And if they really insist that we use their contract, then we'll just go back and forth, have a little negotiation, figure it out and make something work. Right? Okay. I think anything is open to negotiation, and it's just a matter of figuring out what works for both parties and coming to an agreement.
Mm-hmm. Well, this has been some really good stuff here, Brett. What I'd love to do is to have you back again on the show sometime and maybe talk about the more technical side of the whole thing and who's responsible for what more not so much in taking the photo, but what happens with the photos. You just talked about the photo illustrations, but there's a lot more stuff involved whenever you get to the electronic side that maybe we can come back someday and discuss that side of it.
I'd love to do that.
Okay. I appreciate that. Now, why don't you tell people if they're interested in seeing some of your work or getting a hold of you, how would people go about getting a hold of you?
The easiest way is to go to my website probably, and that's brettgilmour.com. And it's just BRETTGILMOUR.com. Everything you need to know is there. From there, there's a blog that is called advertisingphotography.ca. And that's where we post some of the new work that we're doing. We'd love to hear from anybody.
Great. Well, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thank you for the opportunity. Really appreciate it, Mark.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that interview with Brett Gilmour. Please do check out his website. He has some amazing photography there. And definitely give him a call if you can use his services. Now, don't forget to download my cheat sheet with questions to ask when you're hiring a photographer. Once again, you can get that at resourcefuldesigner.com/photographer cheat sheet. So that's it for this episode. In the next episode of Resourceful Designer, I'm going to discuss what happens when you try to wear too many hats in your business, take it all on, with a little condition called superhero syndrome. So I hope you can join me for that one. But until then, keep up the great work running your design studio. I'm Mark Dacote, reminding you to always stay creative.
Thanks for listening to the Resourceful Designer podcast at resourcefuldesigner.com.